In the prestigious world of corporate law, Marcus Johnson has always been judged by the color of his skin instead of the brilliance of his mind. When the most powerful law firm in the city rejects him for not being a cultural fit, Marcus thinks it's just another closed door. But fate has other plans. Robert Harrington, billionaire CEO and the firm's biggest client, has been watching Marcus's career from the shadows. Now facing a terminal diagnosis, he's ready to reveal a 40-year secret that will shake the foundations of power in the city. Father and son, outsider and titan, together they'll challenge a system built on exclusion and transform it through justice. But William Matthews, the attorney who rejected Marcus, won't surrender his privileged position without a fight. With medical records stolen, reputations targeted, and billions of dollars at stake, the battle lines are drawn. Prestigious law firm rejects black attorney, then discovers he's their biggest client's son. A story of recognition denied, legacy reclaimed, and the power of truth to transform systems of inequality. What would you do if someone who rejected you suddenly discovered you held the power? Like, comment, and subscribe to join the conversation about fighting for justice in a world that wasn't built for you. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Marcus Johnson's modest apartment as he meticulously adjusted his silk tie in the mirror. At 42, his once jet-black hair now featured distinguished streaks of silver at the temples, telling the story of a legal career built through perseverance rather than privilege. "Today's the day," he whispered to himself, running a hand over the lapel of his impeccably tailored navy suit, not from the luxury designers that attorneys at Robinson and Williams typically wore, but the best he could afford on a mid-size firm salary. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister, Maya. "Knock 'em dead, big brother. Mom would be so proud." Marcus smiled. Their mother had worked double shifts as a nurse to put him through college after their father disappeared before Marcus was born. She didn't live to see him graduate from Howard Law School with honors, but her voice remained his constant guide. He grabbed his leather portfolio, containing copies of his resume highlighting 12 years of exemplary legal work, the Harvard Law Review article he'd published last year, and detailed notes on Robinson and Williams' recent cases. Marcus had prepared for this interview with the same meticulous attention he brought to his courtroom arguments. "Robinson and Williams," he practiced saying aloud. The name carried weight in legal circles, the most prestigious firm in the city, representing Fortune 500 companies and influential political figures. Their corner offices overlooked the city from the top floor of a gleaming downtown skyscraper, a stark contrast to the cramped space Marcus shared with two other associates at Daniels and Moore. His current firm had been a solid starting point, but after more than a decade, Marcus found himself repeatedly passed over for partnership while watching less experienced white colleagues advance. His case record was impeccable. He hadn't lost a trial in 3 years, yet he remained relegated to handling routine matters rather than the high-profile cases his expertise warranted. The Robinson and Williams opportunity had come unexpectedly. A law school classmate who'd made partner there mentioned they were expanding their corporate litigation department and suggested Marcus apply. The invitation felt like vindication. Finally, his record would speak for itself. As Marcus gathered his keys, his phone rang. "Marcus Johnson," he answered professionally. "Marcus, it's James Wilson." His mentor's warm voice came through the speaker. James had been one of the few black partners at a major firm before retiring to teach law. "Professor, good to hear from you. I was just heading out for that interview." "That's why I'm calling. Word travels fast in our circles. William Matthews is heading their hiring committee now." Marcus paused. "Matthews, isn't he the one who—" "Yes, 3 discrimination complaints from minority associates in 5 years, all quietly settled. Nothing sticks to him because his father-in-law is the founding partner." Marcus took a deep breath. "I appreciate the heads up, but I've dealt with the William Matthews types my whole career." "I know you have, son. Just document everything. And remember, they need your talent more than you need their name on your resume." After ending the call, Marcus checked his watch, still 45 minutes early. Perfect. He always arrived ahead of schedule, a habit his mother had instilled. "Never give them a reason," she'd say, "not even a minute." The drive downtown gave Marcus time to mentally review Robinson and Williams' client roster. Their biggest account, Harrington Enterprises, had recently announced plans for a major expansion. The CEO, Robert Harrington, was notoriously demanding with his legal team. Marcus had researched the company thoroughly, identifying potential legal challenges they might face during their expansion. Parking in the visitors section of the underground garage, Marcus took a moment to center himself. He'd practiced law in this city for 12 years, built a sterling reputation, won challenging cases, and earned the respect of judges and opposing counsel alike. He belonged in those corner offices as much as anyone. The elevator ascended smoothly to the 30th floor. When the doors opened, Marcus stepped into a reception area of marble and glass. A young white woman at the desk looked up with a practiced smile. "Good morning. Marcus Johnson for my 10 o'clock with Mr. Matthews." Her smile faltered slightly, almost imperceptibly, as she looked him over. "Mr. Matthews, are you sure? I don't see anything on his calendar until noon." Marcus maintained his professional demeanor. "Yes, I confirmed yesterday for the corporate litigation position." Oh, understanding crossed her face. "That interview, let me call his assistant." While she made the call, Marcus took in his surroundings. The wall of partner portraits featured 23 faces, all white except for one Asian woman. The waiting area displayed bound volumes of legal achievements and framed newspaper articles featuring the firm's victories. This was the environment he aspired to join, where legal excellence was celebrated and rewarded. After several minutes, a harried-looking young man emerged. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Kevin, Mr. Matthews' assistant." "I'm sorry, but there seems to have been a scheduling confusion. Mr. Matthews is in a meeting, but he can see you in about 30 minutes if you're willing to wait." Despite having confirmed the appointment twice, Marcus simply nodded. "I understand, these things happen." Kevin looked relieved. "Thank you for your patience. Can I get you some coffee while you wait?" "Coffee would be great, thank you." As Kevin disappeared, Marcus discreetly made a note in his phone. "Arrived 15 minutes early for 10:00 appointment. Told Matthews unavailable until 10:30 despite confirmation." He'd learned long ago to document these small indignities. The 30 minutes stretched to 45 before Kevin reappeared. "Mr. Matthews will see you now." Marcus followed him through a labyrinth of hallways lined with offices where attorneys and paralegals worked in focused silence. They finally reached a corner office with sweeping views of the city. Inside, a middle-aged white man with graying blonde hair sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, reviewing documents without looking up. "Mr. Matthews, this is Marcus Johnson," Kevin announced before quietly backing out of the room. William Matthews finally raised his head, offering a cursory glance and a thin smile. "Johnson. Sorry for the wait, been a morning." He gestured to a chair. "Have a seat." As Marcus sat, he noted Matthews hadn't stood to shake his hand, a small but telling breach of professional courtesy. So, Matthews began, finally looking at Marcus properly, surprise briefly flashing across his face. "You're from Daniels and Moore?" "Yes, I've been there for 12 years, specializing in corporate litigation. Before that, I clerked for Judge Reynolds on the federal circuit." Matthews raised an eyebrow. "Reynolds. Interesting choice." Marcus kept his expression neutral, recognizing the implication about the judge known for his progressive rulings on civil rights. "I see you went to Howard for law school," Matthews continued, scanning Marcus's resume with a slight frown. "And your undergrad was at Yale, double major in economics and political science, summa cum laude." A flicker of something disbelief perhaps crossed Matthews' face. "Yale, right." He set down the resume. "Tell me, what makes you think you'd be a good fit for Robinson and Williams? Our firm has a certain culture. Our clients expect a particular type of representation." Marcus had prepared for this question, but the emphasis on culture and type made the subtext clear. "I believe my record speaks to that question," Marcus replied evenly. "I've maintained a 94% success rate in litigation, including the Westmoreland case last year, which involved similar issues to what Harrington Enterprises might face in their expansion plans." Matthews leaned back. "You've researched our clients." "Of course. I understand Mr. Harrington is particularly hands-on with his legal team. My approach to client communication." "Let me stop you there," Matthews interrupted. "While your background is interesting, I'm concerned about whether you'd fit our environment. Our attorneys come primarily from Harvard, Yale, Stanford." "I graduated from Yale undergraduate and was editor of the Law Review at Howard," Marcus reminded him calmly. Matthews waved dismissively. "Yes, but Howard is, well, different from the institutions that typically feed into firms like ours. Our clients have certain expectations for the attorneys representing them." The implication hung in the air, unmistakable and familiar. "Perhaps you could clarify which specific qualifications you feel I'm lacking," Marcus suggested, maintaining his professional tone while reaching for his phone to record the time and exact wording. Matthews' eyes narrowed. "This isn't about qualifications on paper, it's about intangibles, presence, connections, understanding our clientele." He glanced at his watch. Look, I appreciate your interest, but I don't think you'd be comfortable here. Our associates work 70, sometimes 80-hour weeks. It's a demanding environment. My current billable hours average 75 per week, Marcus countered. And I've maintained that schedule while publishing legal articles and serving on the Bar Association's Ethics Committee. A flash of irritation crossed Matthew's face. Johnson, let's not waste each other's time. The position requires someone who can seamlessly integrate with our team and represent our firm's image to high-net-worth clients. I'm not convinced you're that person. Marcus recognized the dismissal for what it was. He'd encountered this barrier before, the intangible fit that somehow always excluded people who looked like him, regardless of their qualifications. I understand, Marcus said, rising from his chair with dignity intact. Thank you for considering my application. Matthews barely looked up, already reaching for his phone. Kevin will show you out. As Marcus followed Kevin back through the maze of hallways, he discreetly completed his notes on his phone, documenting Matthews' exact words. His face revealed nothing of the familiar disappointment and frustration churning inside him. At the elevator, Kevin offered a sympathetic glance. For what it's worth, your reputation at the courthouse is excellent. The paralegals talk about how you always acknowledge their work, unlike most of the partners here. Marcus gave him a genuine smile. Thank you, Kevin, I appreciate that. As the elevator doors closed, Marcus took a deep breath. This wasn't his first rejection based on factors beyond his control, and the familiar sting hadn't lessened with experience. But he had learned to channel the disappointment into determination. Back in his car, he called James Wilson. How bad? His mentor asked without preamble. The usual, not a good fit. Different culture, client expectations. James sighed heavily. Did you document it? Every word, every time stamp, Marcus confirmed. Not that it matters. Nothing will come of it. Maybe, maybe not, but documentation builds patterns and patterns eventually become undeniable. James paused. What's your next move? Marcus started his car, watching as William Matthews emerged from the building's front entrance, heading toward a waiting luxury sedan. For now, I go back to work. I have a deposition at 2. He pulled out of the parking space. But this isn't over. Something tells me our paths will cross again. As Marcus drove away from Robinson and Williams, he couldn't know how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how soon the tables would turn in a way neither he nor William Matthews could possibly anticipate. Marcus arrived at his office at Daniels and Moore by noon, his expression revealing nothing of the morning's disappointment. The firm occupied the 12th floor of a modest downtown building, respectable but lacking the opulence of Robinson and Williams. The reception area featured practical furniture, local artwork, and a small table with coffee and water for clients. There you are, Alyssa Chen, a third-year associate, intercepted him in the hallway. How did it go? Did they fall at your feet? Are we losing you to the ivory tower? Marcus offered a measured smile. Let's just say Robinson and Williams and I have different perspectives on what constitutes a good fit. Alyssa's enthusiasm faltered. Their loss. Seriously, Marcus, if they can't recognize your talent, they don't deserve it. I appreciate that. Is everything set for the Westmoreland deposition? All prepared, conference room B at 2. I've organized the exhibits alphabetically and chronologically with separate tabs for the contested documents. Perfect. Let's meet at 1:30 to review strategy. Marcus continued to his office, a modest space with just enough room for a desk, 2 client chairs and bookshelves lined with legal volumes. Unlike the sprawling corner office Matthews occupied, Marcus's window offered a view of the brick wall of the adjacent building. Still, he'd made the space his own with framed diplomas, a photo of his mother in her nursing uniform, and a small collection of vintage law books inherited from James Wilson. He had barely settled at his desk when his phone rang. Marcus Johnson speaking. Mr. Johnson, this is Sandra Williams from Robert Harrington's office. Marcus sat up straighter. Robert Harrington, CEO of Harrington Enterprises, Robinson and Williams' biggest client. Yes, Ms. Williams, how can I help you? Mr. Harrington would like to schedule a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. Tomorrow morning would be preferable. Marcus checked his calendar, mind racing. How had Harrington even heard of him? I could make 9 a.m. tomorrow work. May I ask what this concerns? Mr. Harrington prefers to discuss that in person. The meeting will be at his downtown office. I'll email the details. After the call ended, Marcus sat back, puzzled. Harrington was known for being methodical and deliberate. His companies spanned real estate, technology, and hospitality, making him one of the wealthiest men in the state. What business could he possibly have with an attorney from a mid-sized firm, especially when he had Robinson and Williams at his disposal? A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas Daniels, the firm's founding partner, stood in the doorway, his 68-year-old frame slightly stooped but his eyes sharp as ever. "Got a minute, Marcus?" "Of course, Tom." Daniels closed the door behind him. "Just ran into Matthews at the courthouse. He mentioned you interviewed at Robinson and Williams this morning." Marcus maintained a neutral expression. "News travels fast. Small legal community." Daniels settled into a chair. He seemed quite pleased with himself, said something about maintaining standards. Marcus's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "I'm sure he did. It's their loss," Daniels said, echoing Alyssa's words. "But between us, I've been meaning to talk to you about your future here." "I'm listening." "The partners are meeting next week to vote on new admissions. Your name is at the top of the list." For a moment, Marcus was speechless. After years of watching others advance ahead of him, partnership had begun to feel like a mirage, always visible but never quite reachable. "I appreciate that, Tom, truly." Daniels waved away his thanks. "It's long overdue. Between your case record and client retention numbers, you've earned it twice over. We should have done this last year." He rose to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Robert Harrington's office called the main line asking for your contact information. They just reached out. I'm meeting him tomorrow." Daniels' eyebrows shot up. "Interesting timing. Harrington's been exclusively with Robinson and Williams for 15 years. After Daniels left, Marcus turned to his computer to research everything he could find about Robert Harrington. Beyond the basic biographical information, 68 years old, widowed, no children publicly acknowledged, Marcus focused on Harrington's business dealings and legal challenges. The man had built his empire methodically, starting with a single apartment building in his 20s and expanding into a real estate portfolio worth billions. 10 years ago, he diversified into technology and hospitality. Throughout his career, he'd maintained a reputation for tough but ethical business practices, unusual in his circles. Most interestingly, Harrington had recently announced a $50 million investment in community development for historically underserved neighborhoods. The press release mentioned personal connections to these communities, though specifics were vague. Following morning, Marcus arrived at Harrington Tower 15 minutes early. The building stood 40 stories tall, its glass exterior reflecting the morning sun. The lobby featured marble floors, a soaring ceiling, and a massive sculpture of intertwined bronze figures representing unity. At the security desk, Marcus presented his ID. "Marcus Johnson for a 9 a.m. meeting with Mr. Harrington." The security officer checked his list. "Yes, Mr. Johnson, Ms. Williams will escort you up." Almost immediately, a tall black woman in her 50s approached. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Sandra Williams, Mr. Harrington's executive assistant. Thank you for coming." She led him to a private elevator that opened directly into a reception area on the 40th floor. Unlike the ostentatious lobby, this space was elegantly understated, comfortable seating, original artwork from black artists, and expansive views of the city. "Mr. Harrington will see you now," Sandra said, leading him to a set of double doors. Robert Harrington's office was surprisingly modest for a billionaire CEO. While spacious, it featured practical furniture, walls lined with books rather than awards, and a desk that, while clearly expensive, showed signs of years of use. Harrington himself stood as Marcus entered. A tall man with dark brown skin and close-cropped white hair, he carried his 68 years with the confidence of someone accustomed to command but not arrogance. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming." His handshake was firm, his gaze direct and appraising. "Please have a seat." As they settled into chairs in a small seating area, Marcus noted the framed photographs on a side table, Harrington with various dignitaries at charity events, and one that appeared to be from decades earlier showing a much younger Harrington with his arm around a woman who seemed vaguely familiar. "I've been following your career with interest," Harrington began, surprising Marcus. "The Westmoreland case particularly caught my attention." "Brilliant strategy." "Thank you, sir, that's very kind." Harrington studied him for a moment. "You're wondering why I asked you here." The thought had crossed my mind. A small smile crossed the older man's face. "Direct, I appreciate that." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm planning a substantial restructuring of my holdings. The legal implications are significant. I need representation I can trust." "You have Robinson and Williams," Marcus pointed out. "They're one of the top firms in the country." "Yes, and they've served their purpose, but this matter requires a different perspective." Harrington paused. "I understand you interviewed there yesterday." Marcus carefully controlled his surprise. "News does travel fast. William Matthews and I had lunch yesterday. He mentioned meeting an attorney from Daniels and more who wasn't a good cultural fit. When he described you, I became curious." "May I ask why?" Harrington rose and walked to his desk, returning with a folder. Your legal record is impressive. Harvard offered you a full scholarship, yet you chose Howard Law. My mother attended Howard's nursing school. It was important to her. Harrington nodded thoughtfully. Family loyalty, another quality I value. He opened the folder. Top of your class, editor of the Law Review, clerkship with Judge Reynolds, then Daniels and Moore, where you've won 17 of your last 18 cases. You've done your research. I always do. What Matthews failed to appreciate yesterday is the same thing others have overlooked throughout your career. Exceptional talent doesn't always arrive in expected packages. Marcus maintained his professional demeanor, though his curiosity was piqued. Mr. Harrington, you clearly didn't call me here just to compliment my record. No, I didn't. Harrington closed the folder. I'm preparing to announce a major initiative, restructuring my companies to create substantial investment in underserved communities while maintaining profitability. The legal challenges are complex. I want you to handle it. Marcus blinked. Instead of Robinson and Williams, alongside them initially, eventually perhaps instead. Harrington's expression was unreadable. I'd like you to attend a meeting at their offices tomorrow morning, my regular quarterly review with their legal team. That was unusual indeed. Already informed them I'm bringing my own counsel. A faint smile crossed Harrington's face. William Matthews was particularly displeased. Marcus considered this carefully. While I'm honored by your confidence, Mr. Harrington, I have to ask why me? There are many qualified attorneys with more experience in corporate restructuring. Harrington was silent for a moment, his gaze shifting to the photograph of the younger version of himself with the woman. Let's just say I have my reasons, Mr. Johnson. Some of which may become clear in time. He stood, signaling the meeting's end. Sandra will send you the details for tomorrow's meeting, 9 a.m. at Robinson and Williams. I look forward to seeing how you handle yourself. As Marcus stood, Harrington added, one more thing, I'd appreciate your discretion regarding our discussion today. The full nature of my plans isn't yet public. Back in the elevator, Marcus tried to process what had just happened. Robert Harrington, billionaire CEO and Robinson and Williams' most prestigious client, wanted him, an attorney they'd just rejected at their meeting tomorrow. The situation felt laden with undercurrents he couldn't quite grasp. As the elevator descended, his phone buzzed with a calendar invitation. Harrington Enterprises Quarterly Legal Review, Robinson and Williams, 9 a.m. Followed by another notification. Thomas Daniels had called an emergency partners meeting for that afternoon. Marcus stepped out into the lobby, the weight of the bronze Unity sculpture above him suddenly feeling symbolic. Something significant had been set in motion, though he couldn't yet see where it would lead or why he had been chosen to play a part in it. The law offices of Robinson and Williams took on a different atmosphere when Marcus arrived the next morning. Unlike the previous day when he'd been kept waiting, the receptionist greeted him by name and immediately notified someone of his arrival. Within minutes, a young associate appeared to escort him to the conference room. Mr. Johnson, I'm Laura Winters, she introduced herself, clearly curious about his presence. Mr. Harrington mentioned you'd be joining us today. Thank you for the escort, Ms. Winters, Marcus replied professionally. The conference room occupied the corner of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. A long mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by plush leather chairs. Several attorneys were already present, huddled in small groups, their conversation stopping abruptly when Marcus entered. At the head of the table sat William Matthews, his expression tight as he noticed Marcus. Beside him was an older man Marcus recognized as Gerald Robinson, the founding partner. Mr. Johnson, Matthews said, rising stiffly, we weren't expecting you quite so early. 15 minutes early is on time, Marcus replied evenly. A habit from my mother. Before Matthews could respond, the door opened again and Robert Harrington entered. The attorneys immediately straightened, their demeanor shifting to attentive deference. Gentlemen, ladies, Harrington nodded, taking his place at the opposite end of the table from the partners. He gestured to Marcus. I believe some of you met Mr. Johnson yesterday. He'll be joining us as my personal counsel for these discussions. Gerald Robinson's eyebrows rose slightly. Personal counsel, this is unusual, Robert. Perhaps, Harrington conceded. But as we'll be discussing today, my upcoming initiatives require additional perspective. He turned to Marcus. Please have a seat. Marcus took the chair to Harrington's right, a position of prominence that clearly unsettled the Robinson and Williams attorneys. Matthews in particular seemed to be struggling to maintain his composure. Before we begin, Harrington continued, I'd like a moment alone with Mr. Johnson, if you wouldn't mind giving us the room for 5 minutes. The request, phrased as a courtesy but delivered as a command, left no room for objection. The attorneys filed out Matthews last of all, his gaze lingering suspiciously on Marcus. When the door closed, Harrington activated a switch that frosted the glass walls of the conference room for privacy. "They're rattled," Harrington observed with faint amusement. "Good, they've grown too comfortable." "This feels like more than just a legal consultation," Marcus noted carefully. Harrington studied him for a moment. "You're direct, another quality we share." He reached into his briefcase and removed a small photo album, placing it on the table between them. "Before they return, there's something you should see." Marcus opened the album. The first photo showed a young Robert Harrington, perhaps in his 20s, standing beside a beautiful young woman. Marcus froze. The woman's smile, her eyes, he'd seen them every day of his life in his mirror and in the framed photo on his desk. That's my mother," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor Johnson." Harrington nodded, his expression softening. "The most remarkable woman I ever knew." Marcus stared at him, pieces suddenly falling into place. The familiar features he'd noticed yesterday but couldn't quite place, the interest in his career, the unusual meeting. "You're my father," he stated, not a question but a realization. Harrington nodded. "I am." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. 42 years of questions, of absence, of wondering, compressed into two simple words. "Why now?" he managed, his professional demeanor momentarily fractured. "After all this time, a fair question." Harrington turned to the next page of the album, showing more photos of him with Eleanor. "Your mother and I met when I was developing my first property, an apartment building in her neighborhood. I was 26, she was 22 and putting herself through nursing school." He smiled at the memory. "Eleanor was magnificent, brilliant, determined, principled. We were together for nearly 2 years." "What happened?" "My father happened." Harrington's expression hardened. He was a traditional man with traditional views. When he learned about Eleanor, he threatened to disinherit me, to destroy her reputation, to make it impossible for her to complete her degree. "So you left her," Marcus said, a lifetime of resentment surfacing. "No. I offered to walk away from everything, my family, my inheritance, my business, to be with her." Harrington turned another page, revealing a letter in his mother's handwriting. "Eleanor refused to let me make that sacrifice. She ended our relationship without telling me she was pregnant." Marcus stared at the letter, recognizing his mother's elegant script. "I didn't know about you until after you were born," Harrington continued. "When I found out, I went to her, begged her to reconsider. But Eleanor was adamant she would raise you herself without my family's toxic influence." A shadow crossed his face. "She was right about my father. The man was a monster in many ways." "She told me my father was dead," Marcus said quietly. "Her choice to give you closure rather than uncertainty. I respected her wishes, but I never stopped watching over you both from a distance." Harrington turned another page, revealing newspaper clippings of Marcus's achievements throughout the years: academic honors, law review publications, case victories. "You've been following my career. Every step. Your mother requested I stay away, but she accepted financial support for your education, channeled through scholarships and grants so you'd never know. She was fiercely proud and wanted you to believe you'd earned everything on merit alone." He smiled sadly. "Which you did, regardless of the funding source." Marcus's mind raced, processing decades of history in minutes. "When did she die?" She left nothing to suggest. "Eleanor took our secret to her grave, as promised. She was the most honorable person I've ever known." Harrington closed the album. "I continued to respect her wishes until recently." "What changed?" "I'm dying, Marcus, pancreatic cancer, 6 months, perhaps a year." The statement, delivered matter-of-factly, struck Marcus like a physical blow. To find his father only to lose him again seemed a cruel twist. "I'm sorry," he said, genuine despite his conflicted emotions. "Don't be. I've lived a full life, but facing mortality brings clarity." Harrington leaned forward. "I've built a significant legacy, but it means nothing without someone who understands my values to carry it forward. When I learned you'd applied to Robinson and Williams and then heard Matthew's dismissive comments about you, it felt like Providence, the perfect moment to finally connect." Before Marcus could respond, a knock at the door signaled the attorney's return. Harrington quickly returned the album to his briefcase. "We'll continue this conversation later," he said quietly. "For now, I need my attorney." Marcus took a deep breath, compartmentalizing his personal shock to focus on the professional role he'd been given. As the attorneys filed back in, he straightened in his chair, his expression revealing nothing of the emotional earthquake he'd just experienced. William Matthews took his seat, eyes darting between Marcus and Harrington. "Shall we begin?" he suggested, an edge to his voice. "Indeed," Harrington agreed. "As I mentioned, we have significant changes to discuss regarding my holdings." He gestured to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson will be taking the lead on the new community investment initiative I'm planning." Matthews couldn't hide his surprise. Community investment? Robert, that's not what we discussed for this quarter. The technology acquisition in Singapore. Plans change, Harrington interrupted firmly. I'm allocating $50 million to start, potentially expanding to $200 million over 5 years, directed toward historically underserved communities. Gerald Robinson cleared his throat. That's a substantial redirection, Robert. The tax implications alone. Be managed, Harrington completed. Mr. Johnson has experience in this area, as I believe you discovered yesterday, William. Matthews shifted uncomfortably. We have several associates who could handle community investment matters if that's your new priority. I've made my decision, Harrington stated flatly. Mr. Johnson will handle this initiative, working alongside your team as needed. For the next 2 hours, Marcus observed the dynamics of the room as Harrington outlined his plans. The Robinson and Williams attorneys were clearly unsettled by this unexpected development, but too professional to openly challenge their most valuable client. Matthews in particular seemed to be struggling to reconcile the Marcus Johnson he'd dismissed yesterday with the attorney now seated at Harrington's right hand. When the meeting concluded, Harrington stood. Mr. Johnson and I have further matters to discuss. Thank you all for your time. He turned to Matthews. William, I'll expect your team to provide Mr. Johnson with all relevant files by end of day. As they walked out together, leaving the Robinson and Williams attorneys in stunned silence, Marcus maintained his professional demeanor despite the whirlwind of questions inside him. In the elevator, Harrington pressed the button for the lobby. My driver is waiting, he said. Join me for lunch. We have much to discuss as father and son. Marcus nodded, still processing the morning's revelations. His life had irrevocably changed in the span of 24 hours, from rejected candidate to personal counsel, from fatherless to heir of a billionaire. As the elevator descended, he thought of his mother, wondering what she would make of this unexpected reunion and whether her reasons for keeping them apart still held merit after all these years. In the lobby, Harrington's driver opened the door to a waiting town car. As they settled into the backseat, Harrington turned to Marcus. I know this is overwhelming. You have every right to questions, to anger, to whatever emotions you're experiencing. His voice softened. But I hope you'll give me the chance to know my son before time runs out. Marcus looked at the man beside him, his father, and saw the genuine hope in his eyes. 42 years of absence couldn't be erased in a day, but perhaps understanding could begin. I'd like that, he said simply. As the car pulled away from Robinson and Williams, Marcus glanced back at the towering building. Yesterday, its heights had seemed unattainable. Today, they represented just one small part of a much larger story, his story, that was only beginning to unfold. Marcus sat across from Robert Harrington in a private dining room at Sylvia's, a soul food restaurant in a historically black neighborhood. The choice of venue seemed deliberate, away from the corporate atmosphere of downtown, in a community space where both men could speak freely. I used to bring your mother here, Harrington said, passing Marcus a basket of cornbread. She loved their catfish. Marcus nodded, still processing the morning's revelations. She made catfish every Sunday. Said it reminded her of someone special. He paused. I always assumed she meant her father. She honored our privacy while keeping our connection alive in her own way. Harrington's expression softened. Eleanor was remarkable that way. A server brought their meals, catfish for Harrington, smothered chicken for Marcus. For a few minutes they ate in contemplative silence. You have questions, Harrington finally said. I'll answer whatever I can. Marcus set down his fork. Did you ever consider challenging her decision, fighting for custody or visitation? Every day for years, Harrington admitted. But your mother was clear my father's influence would have been toxic for you. He was a virulent racist, despite building his fortune on developments in predominantly black neighborhoods. He sighed. I chose to respect Eleanor's wishes rather than drag her through legal battles she couldn't afford. So instead, you watched from a distance. I did what I could without violating her terms. The scholarships, the anonymous donations to your school's legal aid program where you volunteered, ensuring Judge Reynolds knew about your application for the clerkship. Harrington met his gaze. I never directly interfered with your achievements, Marcus. I simply tried to remove obstacles where I could. Marcus absorbed this, reconciling his lifelong narrative of self-reliance with this new information. Why did Matthews react so strongly to you bringing me to the meeting? There seemed to be more than just surprise. Perceptive, Harrington nodded. William Matthews is engaged to my goddaughter, Claire Robinson, Gerald's granddaughter. The marriage would essentially merge our family's interests. He's been positioning himself to take over my account when Gerald retires. And now you've introduced a complication. More than he realizes. Harrington took a sip of water. The cancer diagnosis forced me to evaluate my legacy. I've built something substantial, but I'm not proud of how all of it was achieved. Some of my developments displaced families like your mother's. I rationalized it as progress, but at what cost? The Community Investment Initiative is your attempt at atonement. Partly, it's also good business. These communities represent untapped potential, but primarily it's about setting right what I can before I'm gone. Harrington leaned forward. What I didn't mention at the meeting is the scale of what I'm planning. 200 million is just the beginning. I intend to restructure my entire holdings, over $3 billion, into a new corporate entity with a mandate for equitable development. Marcus's eyes widened. That's not just community investment, that's transforming your entire business model. Exactly, and I want you to oversee it not just as my attorney but eventually as my successor. The statement hung in the air between them. Marcus sat back, momentarily speechless. You barely know me, he said finally. I've followed your career for 20 years. I know your character, your values, your exceptional legal mind. Harrington's gaze was steady. You're my son, Marcus. Only family I have, but even if you weren't, you'd be the right person for this. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from Thomas Daniels. I should take this, he apologized. Marcus, Daniels' voice came through, just got a call from William Matthews. He seemed quite disturbed about your appearance at Robinson and Williams this morning. I imagine he was, Marcus replied carefully. Care to enlighten me about what's happening? Suddenly you're representing Robert Harrington. It's complicated, Tom. I'll explain everything when I return to the office. After ending the call, Marcus turned back to Harrington. Word travels fast. Always does in legal circles. Harrington studied him. You haven't answered my proposition. Marcus considered his response carefully. I need time. This is a lot to process. Finding my father, learning about a terminal diagnosis, and being offered control of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise all in the span of 24 hours. Fair enough. Harrington nodded. Take whatever time you need, but I would like you to continue as counsel for the community initiative regardless. I can do that, Marcus agreed. Good, because Matthews won't take this lying down. When he realizes the full scope of what I'm planning and that you're involved, he'll fight it aggressively. Why would he care about community investment? Because it redirects resources he was counting on controlling through his relationship with Claire. The merger he's been planning for years would be significantly less valuable. As they finished their meal, Harrington handed Marcus a thumb drive. All the details of my plans are here, including my medical records. Review them, ask whatever questions you have. He paused. There's also a personal letter I wrote to you years ago but never sent. Eleanor asked me to write it in case something happened to her while you were still young. Marcus accepted the drive, its small weight feeling momentous in his palm. I have a sister, he said suddenly. Maya, she should know about this too. Your half-sister, Harrington nodded. Eleanor's daughter with her husband. I'd like to meet her when you're ready. Outside the restaurant, as they prepared to part ways, Harrington hesitated. One more thing you should know. I've scheduled a board meeting for next Friday to announce the restructuring plan. I'd like you there as both my counsel and my son. That's making quite a statement. It's time for truth, Marcus. I've lived with secrets for too long. He extended his hand, then changed his mind and briefly embraced Marcus instead. Thank you for hearing me out today. When Marcus returned to his office, Thomas Daniels was waiting. The older attorney closed the door behind him. Want to tell me how you went from being rejected by Robinson and Williams yesterday to representing their biggest client today? Marcus took a deep breath. It's a long story, Tom, one I'm still processing myself. He shared the basics, his connection to Harrington, the Community Investment Initiative, his new role as counsel, omitting the cancer diagnosis and succession plans out of respect for Harrington's privacy. Daniels listened with increasing amazement. This is extraordinary. Do you realize what this means for the firm? Harrington's account is worth millions in billable hours. I do, but there's something else you should know. Marcus hesitated. Matthews called Gerald Robinson after our meeting. They're not going to surrender this account without a fight. I wouldn't expect them to, Daniels frowned. But why are you their target? This seems unusually personal. It is. Marcus chose his words carefully. Matthews has personal connections to the Robinson family. My involvement threatens those connections. Understanding dawned on Daniel's face. Office politics at the highest level. Well, we'll need to prepare for whatever they throw at us. He rose to leave, then paused. The partners' vote on your admission is still scheduled for tomorrow. Should we proceed given these developments? Marcus considered this. Yes, whatever happens with Harrington, I've earned my place here. After Daniels left, Marcus closed his office door and inserted the thumb drive into his computer. The files were meticulously organized: financial documents, medical records, community investment plans, and a folder simply labeled personal. Inside was a single document, for Marcus 1995, the year his mother had remarried. The letter was lengthy, detailed, and deeply personal, a father's message to a son he wasn't allowed to know. It explained Harrington's relationship with Alina, his regret at their separation, and his pride in watching Marcus grow from afar. It also detailed the financial provisions he'd made for Marcus and Alina, carefully channeled through trusts and scholarships to honor Alina's wishes for independence. The final paragraph struck him deeply. "I hope someday to know you as a man, to tell you myself how proud I am of who you've become. But if that day never comes, know this: your mother's decision to raise you apart from me and my family's influence was born of wisdom and love. She gave you something I couldn't, the freedom to become your own person, unburdened by wealth or privilege or my father's poisonous worldview. Whatever you achieve in life will be truly yours. That is her greatest gift to you and my greatest regret." Marcus sat back, overwhelmed. The letter confirmed what he'd begun to sense: his mother's choice, though painful, had been made with clear-eyed love. His desk phone buzzed. "Mr. Johnson, there's a Ms. Claire Robinson here to see you." "No appointment." Claire Robinson, William Matthews' fiancée and Gerald Robinson's granddaughter. The connections were becoming clearer. "Send her in," Marcus instructed. The woman who entered his office was poised and elegant, dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly mortgage payment. Her expression was carefully neutral, but tension radiated from her. "Mr. Johnson," she said, extending her hand. "I hope you don't mind my dropping by unannounced." "Ms. Robinson," Marcus replied, gesturing to a chair. "What can I do for you?" She settled into the seat, studying him carefully. "I wanted to meet the attorney who's suddenly become so important to my godfather. Robert speaks highly of you as well." "Does he?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We've always been close, almost like father and daughter, especially since my parents died." The implication was clear: she considered herself Harrington's heir in all but name. "I understand you're engaged to William Matthews," Marcus observed. "Congratulations." "Thank you. William mentioned meeting you yesterday." She paused. "He was quite surprised to see you again this morning." "I imagine he was." Claire leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Johnson, I'll be direct. Robert has been under considerable strain lately. His judgment isn't what it once was. This sudden community investment project is concerning to those who care about his legacy. From what I've seen, Mr. Harrington's judgment is perfectly sound. Perhaps." She opened her handbag and removed a business card, sliding it across the desk. "When you realize the same, call me. I'm sure we could find a place for someone with your talents in our organization after the merger." Marcus left the card on the desk. "Is there anything else I can help you with, Ms. Robinson?" She stood, recognizing the dismissal. "Just consider what I've said. Robert's condition makes him vulnerable to influence. Those who exploit that will be held accountable." After she left, Marcus picked up her card, noting the Robinson and Williams logo and her title, Director of Strategic Planning. He placed it in his desk drawer, then turned back to his computer. Opening the financial files Harrington had provided, he began methodically documenting the complex web of holdings and planned restructuring. If Matthews and the Robinsons were preparing for battle, he needed to be thoroughly armed with information. His phone buzzed again. "Your sister Maya on line 1. "Marcus," Maya's voice came through, concerned. "Are you okay? You sounded strange in your text." "I'm fine," he assured her. "Just something important has come up. Can you meet for dinner tonight? There's someone I think you should meet." "Sounds mysterious," she replied. "Is this about that law firm that rejected you?" "In a way." Marcus glanced at the letter on his screen. "It's about our family history, and possibly our future." The boardroom of Harrington Enterprises hummed with tension. Executives and board members filled the leather chairs surrounding the massive oak table, their murmured conversations falling silent as Robert Harrington entered. Marcus followed a step behind, acutely aware of the curious glances directed his way. "Good morning," Harrington addressed the room, his authoritative presence commanding immediate attention despite his recent weight loss. "Before we begin our usual quarterly review, I have an important announcement." He gestured to Marcus. "This is Marcus Johnson, a highly accomplished attorney who will be joining our executive team as Chief Counsel for Community Development and Investment." William Matthews sat halfway down the table, his jaw visibly tightening. Beside him, Claire Robinson maintained a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Johnson will be overseeing our new community investment initiative," Harrington continued, "a project I consider central to our company's future." Gerald Robinson cleared his throat. "Robert, while we certainly support community initiatives, this seems rather Sudden, the board hasn't reviewed any proposal for a new executive position. The position falls under my direct authority as CEO, Harrington replied smoothly. But you raise a fair point about the initiative itself, he nodded to Marcus. Mr. Johnson, would you distribute the materials? Marcus opened his briefcase and passed out folders containing the overview of Harrington's community investment plans. As the board members began reviewing the documents, their expressions ranged from surprise to concern. $50 million initially. Gerald Robinson looked up sharply. Robert, this represents a significant reallocation of capital that was earmarked for the Singapore acquisition. The Singapore deal will proceed on a modified timeline, Harrington confirmed, but this initiative takes precedence. Matthews leaned forward. With all due respect, sir, we've spent 18 months structuring the Singapore acquisition. Delaying it jeopardizes the entire project. I'm well aware of the timeline, William, Harrington replied. The community initiative will proceed as outlined. Claire interjected, her voice measured. Godfather, perhaps we should discuss this privately before presenting it to the full board, given your recent health concerns. Harrington's expression hardened. My health is not relevant to this discussion, Claire. A tense silence fell over the room. Marcus observed the shifting dynamics, the board members' confusion, Matthew's barely concealed anger, Claire's calculated concern. If I may, Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice calm and authoritative. The community investment initiative isn't simply philanthropy. It's a strategic business decision with significant long-term benefits for Harrington Enterprises. He stood and walked to the display screen, activating a presentation he'd prepared. These historically underserved communities represent untapped markets with substantial growth potential. By investing now, we establish first-mover advantage in areas primed for economic revitalization. For the next 15 minutes, Marcus presented a comprehensive analysis of the initiative's business case, projected returns, tax advantages, brand enhancement, and strategic positioning. The board members' expressions gradually shifted from skepticism to consideration. Most importantly, Marcus concluded, this initiative aligns with market trends showing that socially responsible investments consistently outperform traditional models over 10-year horizons. This isn't charity, it's sound business strategy. Matthews scoffed quietly. Impressive presentation, Mr. Johnson. But I notice your projections conveniently omit the opportunity cost of delaying the Singapore acquisition. Actually, Marcus replied, turning to a specific slide, the analysis accounts for that delay, including potential increased acquisition costs and market timing factors. Even with conservative estimates, the community initiative shows a higher long-term return on investment. Harrington nodded approvingly. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. He turned to the board. I've made my decision on this matter. The initiative proceeds as outlined. Marcus returned to his seat as the meeting continued, aware of Matthew's glare. When they broke for lunch, Harrington motioned for Marcus to follow him to his private office adjacent to the boardroom. Well handled, Harrington said once they were alone. You impressed them. Matthews isn't convinced, Marcus observed. William has never appreciated anything that interferes with his ambitions. Harrington poured himself a glass of water. There's something else I want to announce this afternoon, but I wanted to discuss it with you first. The succession plan. Yes, I'm considering making it public, acknowledging you as my son and naming you as my heir. Marcus sat forward. Are you sure that's wise? It would be a significant shock to everyone, especially Claire. I'm running out of time for caution, Harrington replied. The cancer is progressing faster than initially projected. All the more reason to proceed carefully, Marcus countered. Announcing everything at once could create unnecessary resistance to the community initiative. We should secure that first, then address personal matters. Harrington considered this. Always the strategist, your mother was the same way. He nodded slowly. Very well, we'll focus on the initiative today, but I want to begin the process of publicly acknowledging our relationship soon. Agreed, but let's do it methodically. When they returned to the boardroom, the afternoon session progressed with detailed discussions of the community initiative. By meeting's end, Harrington had secured provisional board approval for the first phase, despite Matthew's continued objections. As the board members filed out, Matthews deliberately lingered, approaching Marcus once the room had cleared. Quite an impressive performance, Mr. Johnson, he said, his cordial tone belied by the coldness in his eyes. You certainly made an impact on your first day. Just doing my job, Marcus replied evenly. Yes, your job, Matthews stepped closer. It's remarkable how quickly you've risen in Robert's estimation. Yesterday, a rejected applicant at my firm, today an executive at Harrington Enterprises. One might wonder what exactly transpired to facilitate such a meteoric ascent. I believe my qualifications speak for themselves. Do they? Matthews smiled thinly. Or is there another explanation? Robert has been unwell recently. His judgment isn't what it once was. Mr. Harrington seems perfectly lucid to me. For now, perhaps. Matthews straightened his tie. Just some friendly advice, Johnson, don't get too comfortable. Robert's enthusiasm for new projects tends to be fleeting. After Matthews departed, Claire entered from a side door. Her expression suggested she'd overheard the exchange. William can be overly protective, she said, approaching Marcus. But his concerns about my godfather are genuine. Robert hasn't been himself lately, Ms. Robinson. Please call me Claire, she smiled warmly, a marked change from their previous interaction. I feel we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I hope we can start fresh. Marcus maintained his professional demeanor. Of course. Robert clearly values your input. Perhaps we could discuss the community initiative further. I have some thoughts on implementation that might be helpful. She gestured to the door. Dinner, perhaps. There's an excellent restaurant in the building. I appreciate the offer, but I have prior commitments this evening, Marcus declined politely. Perhaps another time. Her smile remained, but her eyes cooled slightly. Of course, another time. After she left, Marcus gathered his materials, reflecting on the dual approaches from Matthews and Claire, one overtly antagonistic, the other superficially friendly, but both clearly aimed at determining his role and potentially undermining it. His phone buzzed with a text from Harrington. Car waiting downstairs, dinner with Maya tonight. Marcus replied affirmatively, then headed to the elevator. In the lobby, he spotted Matthews and Claire in deep conversation, their expressions serious. They fell silent as he passed, watching him exit to the waiting town car. Inside the vehicle, Harrington was reviewing documents. Productive day, he noted as Marcus settled in. The board will come around completely once they see the preliminary results. Matthews and Claire are concerned about your health, Marcus observed. They suggested your judgment might be impaired. Harrington laughed without humor. Of course they did. Claire has been positioning herself as my successor for years. This initiative and you represent unexpected complications to her plans. The car navigated through evening traffic toward the restaurant where they would meet Maya. Marcus had briefed his sister minimally, saying only that he'd met someone connected to their family history. Are you ready for this? Harrington asked. Are you? Marcus countered. Maya is protective. She won't be easily won over. Like her brother, Harrington nodded approvingly. I wouldn't expect anything less. The restaurant was an upscale Italian place in a quiet neighborhood. Maya was already waiting in the private dining room Harrington had arranged. She rose as they entered, her expression curious but cautious. Maya, Marcus embraced his sister briefly. Thank you for coming. You know I can't resist a mystery, she replied, her eyes moving to Harrington. Especially one that has my unflappable brother looking so flapped. Maya Johnson, Marcus began formally. This is Robert Harrington. He paused, the words still strange to say aloud. He's our father, Maya froze, her smile fading. What? Over the next hour, Harrington recounted his history with their mother, showing Maya the same photographs and letters he'd shared with Marcus. Unlike her brother, Maya's reactions were openly emotional: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally, reluctant curiosity. Why now? She demanded, echoing Marcus's initial question. After all this time. I'm dying, Harrington said simply, pancreatic cancer, and I couldn't bear the thought of never knowing my son or his sister. Maya looked to Marcus. You believe all this? I've verified what I can, he replied. The timeline matches, the documentation is extensive, and, he hesitated. There's a DNA test, Harrington nodded. I had one done years ago without Marcus's knowledge, hair from a barber shop, a generous tip to the barber, not legally admissible but conclusive. That's creepy, Maya stated flatly. It was wrong, Harrington acknowledged. One of many choices I regret. As dinner progressed, Maya's initial hostility gradually softened, though she remained more guarded than Marcus. By the meal's end, she had agreed to consider accepting Harrington into their lives, though she made no promises. Outside the restaurant, as Maya prepared to leave, she pulled Marcus aside. This is a lot, Marcus. Are you sure about this, about him? I'm still processing it myself, he admitted. But yes, I believe he's genuine. And this job he's given you, you don't think that's about buying your affection? Marcus considered this. It started that way, perhaps. But it's evolved into something more significant. He briefly explained the community initiative, watching Maya's expression shift from skepticism to interest. That actually sounds important, she conceded. Just be careful, okay? Rich white men don't usually give away power without strings attached, even dying ones. After Maya departed, Marcus rejoined Harrington in the car. They rode in companionable silence for several blocks. She's remarkable, Harrington finally said, just like her mother. Half-mother, Marcus corrected. Maya is Alina's daughter with her husband, Richard. Still, I see Alina in her strength, her directness. Harrington smiled faintly. Thank you for arranging this. Maya will need time, we both will. Time, Harrington echoed hollowly. The one thing I'm short on. The car stopped outside Marcus's apartment building. Before exiting, Marcus turned to Harrington. Tomorrow, I'm going to start reviewing all the legal structures for the initiative. If Matthews and Claire are as resistant as they appear, we need to ensure everything is bulletproof. Wise precaution, Harrington nodded. William Matthews didn't become a senior partner at Robinson and Williams by accepting defeat gracefully. As Marcus watched the car pull away, he reflected on the day's events, the board meeting, the veiled threats from Matthews, Claire's strategic olive branch, and the emotional introduction of Maya to their newly discovered father. Each interaction represented a piece of a complex puzzle still taking shape. Inside his apartment, he opened his laptop to find an email from an anonymous account. The subject line read simply, Harrington's medical records. The message contained a single line, before you commit yourself further, you should know the full truth. Attached was a file containing medical records, not from Harrington's current oncologist, but from a psychiatric evaluation conducted 3 years earlier, diagnosing early-stage dementia alongside his cancer. Records that hadn't been included in the materials Harrington had given him. Marcus stared at his laptop screen, the medical records casting a pale glow across his face as midnight approached. The psychiatric evaluation was detailed and thorough, conducted by a respected specialist 3 years earlier, diagnosing early-stage dementia concurrent with Harrington's cancer diagnosis. According to the notes, the initial symptoms were subtle occasional memory lapses, minor confusion about dates, difficulty with complex financial calculations. The prognosis suggested a gradual progression, potentially accelerated by cancer treatments. Setting aside his personal reaction, Marcus methodically verified the document's authenticity. The letterhead matched the medical center. The physician existed and specialized in geriatric psychiatry. The medical license number was valid. Even the digital signature contained the proper metadata. After 2 hours of investigation, he had to concede the records appeared legitimate. The question remained, who had sent them and why hadn't Harrington disclosed this diagnosis? His phone rang Maya despite the late hour. I can't stop thinking about all this, she said without preamble. Have you verified his claims about the cancer, I mean? Marcus hesitated. I've seen his medical records. And they're comprehensive, stage 4 pancreatic cancer with metastasis to the liver. But you're holding something back, Maya observed. I hear it in your voice, Marcus sighed. I just received additional medical information anonymously. What kind of information? A dementia diagnosis from 3 years ago, early stage but progressing. The line went quiet. Finally, Maya spoke. That changes things, doesn't it, if his mental capacity is compromised? It complicates matters, Marcus acknowledged, but it doesn't necessarily invalidate his intentions or the community initiative. Marcus, be realistic. If this gets out, everything he's trying to set up with you will be challenged. People will claim he wasn't competent to make these decisions. People like William Matthews and Claire Robinson. Exactly, you need to confront him about this. I will, tomorrow. After ending the call, Marcus forwarded the records to his secure email, then shut down his laptop. Sleep eluded him as he weighed the implications, both personal and professional. If Harrington's cognitive function was indeed declining, it cast the entire situation in a different light. Next morning, Marcus arrived at Harrington's office early. Sandra Williams looked up from her desk, her usual composure slightly strained. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Harrington is expecting you. Inside the office, Harrington was reviewing documents. He looked up with a smile that faded when he saw Marcus's expression. What's wrong? Marcus placed a printed copy of the psychiatric evaluation on the desk. You didn't tell me everything. Harrington glanced at the document, his face revealing nothing. I see. Is it genuine? Yes, Harrington set aside his papers. The initial diagnosis was 3 years ago. The progression has been slower than initially projected. Why keep it from me? Marcus asked, struggling to maintain his professional demeanor. You shared everything else, the cancer diagnosis, our relationship, your business plans. Because this, Harrington tapped the evaluation, this is what Claire and the others would use to challenge everything. Once people hear dementia, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a problem to be managed. But if your cognitive function is impaired, it isn't, not significantly. Harrington's voice took on an edge. I undergo quarterly cognitive evaluations. My executive function remains intact. My long-term memory is unaffected. Yes, I occasionally struggle with short-term recall and complex calculations, but I've implemented systems to compensate. Systems? Harrington gestured to Sandra through the glass partition. She entered immediately with a thick binder. My cognitive support protocols, Harrington explained as Sandra set down the binder. Daily memory exercises, medication management, structured decision-making frameworks, and independent verification of all major decisions through a panel of trusted advisors. Marcus opened the binder, finding meticulous documentation of Harrington's cognitive maintenance program, including assessments from 3 separate specialists confirming his continued competence to manage his affairs. The cancer will take me before the dementia significantly impairs me, Harrington stated matter-of-factly. The oncologist gives me 6 to 12 months. The neurologist projects significant cognitive decline would take 18 to 24 months to develop at the current progression rate. Marcus processed this information. Who else knows about the dementia diagnosis? My medical team. Sandra, my personal attorney Richard Winters, not connected to Robinson and Williams. And now you. Not Claire, especially not Claire. Harrington's expression darkened. She suspects something is wrong beyond the cancer but doesn't have confirmation. Until now, Marcus noted, someone sent me these records anonymously last night. Harrington's eyes narrowed. Who would have access? He trailed off, then turned to Sandra. Contact Dr. Mendelssohn's office. I want to know if anyone has requested my records recently. As Sandra left to make the call, Harrington turned back to Marcus. This changes your perspective, doesn't it? It raises questions, Marcus admitted, legitimate ones. About my competence to make decisions regarding my company, or about my choice to acknowledge you as my son and potential heir. The direct question caught Marcus off guard. Both, potentially, if your cognitive function is compromised. It isn't, Harrington interrupted firmly. Not yet, but this is precisely why I accelerated my timeline. I need to establish my intentions while my competence remains unquestionable. The anonymous sender clearly wants to create doubt. William Matthews, Harrington stated confidently, or someone working on his behalf. This is exactly his style, undermining from the shadows. Marcus wasn't entirely convinced. It could also be Claire or anyone who opposes the community initiative. Regardless, the timing is strategic, immediately following the board meeting where you made such an impact. Harrington leaned forward. This isn't just about discrediting me, Marcus, it's about discrediting you. Before Marcus could respond, Sandra returned. Dr. Mendelssohn's office confirms that no records have been released through official channels. However, they recently hired a new administrative assistant who has since left abruptly. Investigate her, Harrington instructed, discreetly. After Sandra departed, Marcus picked up the psychiatric evaluation again. Let me be completely clear, you believe you remain competent to make major business and personal decisions? Yes. Harrington met his gaze steadily. But I also recognize the reality of my situation. Both diagnoses are terminal. I don't have the luxury of time to execute my plans gradually or to build our relationship slowly. Marcus nodded slowly. I need to think about all of this, and I need to speak with your doctors myself. I expected nothing less. I'll have Sandra arrange it. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Harrington, William Matthews, and Gerald Robinson are here. They're insisting on seeing you immediately. Harrington raised an eyebrow at Marcus. Perfect timing. Shall we see what they want? Marcus gathered the medical documents, securing them in his briefcase. Let's. Sandra showed Matthews and Gerald Robinson into the office. Both men appeared grave, with Matthews barely concealing his antagonism toward Marcus. Robert, Gerald began, his tone conciliatory but firm. We need to discuss yesterday's board meeting. I thought we covered everything thoroughly, Harrington replied, gesturing for them to sit. New concerns have arisen, Matthews interjected, remaining standing, specifically regarding your health and decision-making capacity. Marcus observed the calculated approach they were leading with the dementia angle, which confirmed his suspicion about who had sent the records. My health is a private matter, Harrington responded calmly. Not when it affects company decisions, Matthews countered. We have information suggesting you've been diagnosed with cognitive impairment that you've concealed from the board. Information you obtained illegally, Marcus stated flatly. Matthews turned to him with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Johnson, this is a private matter between Mr. Harrington and his long-standing legal representation. Mr. Johnson is my counsel for the community initiative, Harrington reminded him, and my personal attorney for related matters. Gerald Robinson sighed heavily. Robert, please, we've been friends for 40 years. We're concerned about you and about this sudden fixation on this community project led by someone you barely know. I know Marcus quite well, Harrington replied evenly. Since yesterday, Matthews scoffed. Since he was born, Harrington stated, his voice suddenly steel. Marcus Johnson is my son. The statement landed like a physical blow. Gerald Robinson's mouth opened in shock while Matthews seemed momentarily speechless. That's absurd, Matthews finally managed. You don't have children. None that were publicly acknowledged, Harrington corrected. Marcus's mother and I agreed to keep his parentage private decades ago for reasons that made sense at the time. Gerald studied Marcus with new eyes. Eleanor Johnson, he said quietly. I remember her, the nurse from the Westside Development Project. Harrington nodded. You have an excellent memory, Gerald. This is. Matthews struggled to regain his composure. Even if this claim is true, it doesn't change the fact that you've concealed a medical condition from the board, a condition that impairs your judgment. My judgment remains sound, Harrington replied, as confirmed by multiple specialists. We'll need independent verification, Matthews insisted. And in the meantime, the board should consider temporary measures to protect the company's interests. You mean removing me as CEO, Harrington translated. Good luck with that, William. My voting shares give me control regardless of board sentiment. Unless you're declared incompetent, Matthews pointed out. Marcus stepped forward. That's enough. Mr. Matthews, you obtained confidential medical records through questionable means. You're now attempting to use that information to orchestrate a hostile takeover of Mr. Harrington's company. These actions could constitute multiple ethical violations worthy of review by the State Bar Association. Matthews turned to him, eyes cold. Protecting a client from their own diminished capacity is not an ethical violation, Mr. Johnson. It's our duty as counsel. Interesting perspective, Marcus replied. I wonder if the Ethics Committee would agree, particularly given your personal connection to Claire Robinson and the clear conflict of interest it presents. Gerald Robinson raised his hands placatingly. Gentlemen, please, this isn't helping, he turned to Harrington. Robert, we're not your enemies. We're trying to protect your legacy, including from those who might take advantage of your condition. My legacy is precisely what I'm securing, Gerald. Harrington's voice softened slightly. The community initiative isn't a whim or a symptom of cognitive decline. It's a carefully considered business strategy with significant long-term benefits, as Marcus demonstrated yesterday. A strategy developed by a newly discovered son who stands to benefit enormously, Matthews noted sarcastically. A strategy I began developing 3 years ago, Harrington corrected. Marcus is helping implement it, but the vision is mine. Gerald studied Harrington thoughtfully. If what you say about your condition is true, that your competence remains intact, you should have no objection to an independent evaluation. I don't, Harrington agreed, but I will not pause the community initiative during that process. It proceeds as planned. Matthews opened his mouth to object, but Gerald silenced him with a glance. Fair enough, we'll arrange an independent assessment through a neutral specialist. After they departed, Harrington turned to Marcus. And so it begins. They'll challenge everything now, Marcus noted. Your competence, my parentage, the initiative itself. Let them. Harrington smiled thinly. I've prepared for this fight longer than they realize. Marcus considered the rapid escalation of events. We need to move quickly to secure the initial funding for the initiative before they can interfere. Already in progress. The first $20 million was transferred this morning to the new Community Development Corporation. The paperwork is on your desk at Daniels and Moore. Marcus nodded approvingly at the strategic move. What about the paternity claim? They'll demand verification. DNA testing is already arranged, results in 3 days. And the independent cognitive evaluation? My doctors are preparing a comprehensive assessment. I have nothing to hide regarding my current capacity. Harrington paused, but we should accelerate the timeline for the full restructuring announcement. We can't give Matthews time to organize opposition. Agreed, I'll prepare the legal framework immediately. Marcus checked his watch. I should get to the office. The partners are voting on my admission today. In light of recent developments, do you still want that partnership? Marcus considered the question. Yes, whatever happens with all of this, I've earned that recognition for my work. Harrington nodded approvingly. You have your mother's principle, and perhaps a bit of my strategic thinking. As Marcus prepared to leave, Harrington added, William Matthews won't stop with legal maneuvering. He'll attack personally your reputation, your record, anything he can use to discredit you. I'm aware, Marcus replied, but I've faced that kind of opposition my entire career. I know how to handle it. Yes, Harrington said with quiet pride, I believe you do. 3 weeks had transformed Marcus Johnson's life in ways he could scarcely have imagined. The partnership at Daniels and Moore, once his primary professional ambition, now represented just one facet of his rapidly expanding responsibilities. The partners had voted unanimously to admit him, a validation of his 12 years of dedicated service that felt somehow both momentous and secondary to the larger events unfolding. The DNA results had confirmed what Marcus already knew. Robert Harrington was his biological father. The independent cognitive evaluation had likewise validated Harrington's continued competence, though noting the early indicators of dementia remained present. Most significantly, the initial $20 million of the community initiative had been successfully deployed, with Marcus overseeing the establishment of the Harrington Community Development Corporation as its legal structure. On this crisp autumn morning, Marcus stood at the window of his new office in the Harrington Tower, 39th floor, one below Robert's executive suite. The space was elegant yet practical, reflecting Marcus's own preferences rather than ostentatious corporate decor. He had insisted on maintaining his position at Daniels and Moore while taking on the Harrington responsibilities, working between both offices as needed. Sandra Williams entered after a brief knock. The press conference is scheduled for 11 a.m. Media confirmations are higher than anticipated. Thank you, Sandra. Marcus checked his watch. Is Robert ready? As ready as he'll be, she replied, her professional demeanor softening slightly. This means everything to him, you know, making things right. Marcus nodded. Today, Robert Harrington would publicly announce two significant developments: the full scope of the Community Investment Initiative, now expanded to $200 million immediately, with a long-term commitment of up to $3 billion, and the acknowledgement of Marcus as his son and named successor. The door opened again and Maya entered, immaculately dressed for the press conference. The vultures are circling, she reported, referring to the gathered media. And William Matthews just arrived with Claire Robinson and a small army of Robinson and Williams attorneys. Expected, Marcus replied. They'll try to create doubt about Robert's competence or my legitimacy. Let them try, Maya said firmly. Her initial skepticism about Robert had evolved into fierce protectiveness over the past weeks as she'd witnessed his genuine desire to rectify past injustices. Our mother would be proud of how you're handling this. A soft chime from Marcus's phone alerted him to a text from Thomas Daniels. Motion filed in district court. Matthews seeking temporary injunction against fund transfers. Judge Watkins assigned. Marcus showed the message to Maya. Right on schedule. Judge Watkins, she noted, isn't she? A former Robinson and Williams partner, Marcus confirmed. They're playing every angle, the intercom buzzed. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Matthews is requesting a meeting before the press conference. He says it's in everyone's best interest. Marcus exchanged glances with Maya. Send him in. William Matthews entered alone, his customary arrogance tempered by the strain of recent weeks. The challenge to Harrington's competence had failed. The DNA confirmation had undermined his attempts to question Marcus's legitimacy. The community initiative's first projects were already underway, garnering positive press and community support. Mr. Johnson, Matthews nodded curtly. Ms. Johnson. Mr. Matthews, Marcus replied evenly. What can we do for you? Matthews straightened his tie, visibly uncomfortable. I'll be direct. This public announcement today is unnecessary and potentially damaging to all parties involved. How so? Marcus asked. The revelation of Robert's condition, however managed it may currently be, will create market uncertainty. The acknowledgement of a previously unknown heir will raise questions about succession planning. Both could negatively impact Harrington Enterprises' stock value. Your concern for the company's stock price is touching, Maya remarked dryly. Matthews ignored her. I'm authorized to offer an alternative. The community initiative proceeds as planned, under joint oversight from both your team and Robinson and Williams. Robert delays the public acknowledgement of your relationship until a more appropriate time. More appropriate than when he's still alive to affirm it himself, Marcus asked pointedly. Matthews's jaw tightened. These matters could be handled more discreetly, through proper legal channels rather than a media spectacle. Marcus studied the man who had dismissed him so casually just weeks ago. What's Claire's position on this proposal? A flicker of surprise crossed Matthews's face at the direct question. Claire recognizes the potential for unnecessary complications. I'm sure she does, Marcus nodded. And Gerald Robinson? Mr. Robinson respects Robert's wishes but feels the timing is problematic. Marcus leaned against his desk. Mr. Matthews, let me be clear, the press conference proceeds as planned. The community initiative will be fully implemented according to Robert's vision, and my relationship with my father will be acknowledged publicly as he wishes. Matthews's professional veneer cracked slightly. You realize this isn't over. The court filings. Before Judge Watkins, yes, we're aware, Marcus smiled slightly. You should know that Judge Watkins recused herself an hour ago due to her previous association with Robinson and Williams. The case has been reassigned to Judge Thompson. Matthews paled visibly. Everett Thompson was known for his strict ethical standards and impartiality. One more thing, Marcus added. The State Bar Association has been notified about potential ethics violations regarding the acquisition and use of confidential medical records. They're quite interested in how those records made their way to you. You have no proof of any ethical violations, Matthews retorted, though his confidence was clearly shaken. Perhaps not yet, Marcus acknowledged. But investigations have a way of uncovering unexpected connections. The intercom buzzed again. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Harrington is ready whenever you are. Thank you, Marcus responded, then turned back to Matthews. Is there anything else we can help you with before the press conference? Matthews straightened, regaining his composure with visible effort. This isn't personal, Johnson, it's business. It became personal the moment you judged me unworthy of consideration based on factors that had nothing to do with my qualifications, Marcus replied. But you're right about one thing, it is also business. And in both arenas, you've miscalculated significantly. After Matthews departed, Maya gave a low whistle. That was satisfying to watch. Don't celebrate yet, Marcus cautioned. He's backed into a corner, which makes him dangerous. They took the private elevator to the 40th floor where Robert waited in his office. Despite the accelerating toll of his cancer, he carried himself with dignity, his suit impeccably tailored to disguise his weight loss. Marcus, Maya, he greeted them warmly. Ready for the circus? As ready as we'll ever be, Maya replied. Matthews just made a last-ditch effort to delay the announcement. Predictable, Robert nodded. Claire tried the same approach last night, tears, reminiscence about her childhood, concern for my legacy and reputation. He shook his head. As if my legacy is served by continuing to hide the truth. Marcus checked his phone one last time before they would need to surrender their devices for the press conference security protocol. A new message from Sandra appeared. Admin assistant confirmed, paid $5,000 by third party for access to medical records. Investigation ongoing. We have confirmation on the medical records leak, he informed Robert. Not directly traceable to Matthews yet, but we're getting closer. Good, Robert nodded. Not that it matters much after today. Once everything is public, those records lose their power as leverage. A knock at the door signaled it was time. Robert rose, squaring his shoulders. Whatever happens next, these past weeks have been the most meaningful of my life. Getting to know both of you, setting right what I can, it matters more than anything I've built. Together, they walked to the conference room, where dozens of reporters and cameras waited. The executive team was seated in the front row, their expressions ranging from supportive to concerned. William Matthews and Claire Robinson stood at the back, while Gerald Robinson occupied a seat near the center, symbolically neutral. As Robert approached the podium, a heavy silence fell over the room. For the next 30 minutes, he delivered a masterful address, outlining the full scope of the Community Investment Initiative in detail. He explained the economic rationale, the implementation timeline, and the expected outcomes, a vision not of charity but of strategic investment in underserved communities with untapped potential. Then he paused, his expression softening. There is one more announcement today, one of a more personal nature. He gestured to Marcus and Maya to join him at the podium. Many of you have speculated about my new chief counsel, Marcus Johnson, and his rapid rise within Harrington Enterprises. Today I can confirm that Marcus is my son. A ripple of murmurs and camera clicks swept through the room. 42 years ago, I made choices that separated me from Marcus and his mother, Eleanor Johnson. Those choices, while complex in context, represent my greatest regret. Today, I acknowledge Marcus as my son and heir, along with his sister Maya, who has become dear to me in the short time I've known her. The reporters erupted with questions, but Robert raised his hand for silence. I have been diagnosed with terminal cancer, with limited time remaining. I have also been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, which is being successfully managed through comprehensive medical protocols. Before questioning my competence, be aware that multiple independent evaluations have confirmed my continued capacity to manage my affairs and make sound decisions. He gestured to Marcus. The Harrington Community Development Corporation will proceed under Marcus's leadership, transforming how we invest in communities that have historically been exploited rather than empowered. This isn't atonement, it's sound business strategy with the additional benefit of creating meaningful positive impact. As the press conference concluded, Marcus stepped to the podium to address specific questions about the initiative's legal structure and implementation timeline. His responses were precise, authoritative, and comprehensive, demonstrating not only his legal expertise but his deep understanding of the communities the initiative would serve. From the back of the room, William Matthews watched with thinly veiled frustration as his attempts to undermine the announcement collapsed in real time. Beside him, Claire Robinson's composed facade had cracked, revealing the anger beneath her polished exterior. After the formal press conference, Robert invited key stakeholders to a smaller reception. Marcus found himself approached by Gerald Robinson, who had separated himself from Matthews and Claire. "Your father was right about you," the older attorney said quietly. "You have his strategic mind and your mother's principles, a powerful combination." "Thank you," Marcus replied cautiously. "William overplayed his hand," Robinson continued. "He convinced himself and my granddaughter that they were entitled to Robert's legacy. I didn't support their methods. Yet you didn't stop them." "No," Robinson acknowledged. "A failure I regret." He extended his hand. "For what it's worth, I would have hired you in a heartbeat after seeing your presentation to the board." William's judgment was flawed. Across the room, Robert was engaged in conversation with community leaders invited to the announcement. Despite his physical frailty, his expression showed more peace than Marcus had seen since meeting him. Maya joined Marcus after Robinson departed. "The share price is actually up 3% since the announcement. So much for Matthew's prediction of market panic." "The markets can recognize sound strategy when they see it," Marcus observed. "Speaking of strategy," Maya lowered her voice, "have you decided what you'll do about the Robinson and Williams connection long-term? They're still handling significant portions of Harrington's legal work." "For now," Marcus nodded. "But I've been in discussions with Thomas Daniels about a potential merger, bringing key attorneys from Daniels and more into a new legal division within Harrington Enterprises. We'll gradually transition away from Robinson and Williams for most matters." "Elegant solution," Maya approved. "Create your own firm rather than joining theirs." As the reception continued, Marcus found a moment to step onto the balcony for fresh air. The city stretched before him, the downtown skyscrapers where he'd built his career, the neighborhoods to the east where he'd grown up, and the communities to the west where the initiative's first projects were already underway. Robert joined him, moving slower now as the day's activities took their toll. "Worth the fight?" Marcus asked quietly. "Every moment," Robert confirmed. "Though our battle isn't quite over, Matthews and Claire won't surrender easily." "No," Marcus agreed, "but they've lost their principal leverage. The truth is out now about your health, about our relationship, about the initiative." "Truth has a clarifying effect," Robert noted. "It reveals people's true character." He gestured back toward the reception. "Some have risen to the occasion, others have revealed their limitations." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, father and son. "I've been thinking about Alina," Robert said finally, "about whether she would approve of all this. The public acknowledgement or the initiative?" "Both," Marcus considered this. "The public aspects would make her uncomfortable, she valued privacy, but the initiative," he smiled. "That would make her proud, she always believed privilege carried responsibility." "A lesson she taught you well," Robert observed, "and one I learned too late." Inside, the reception continued. Media interviews were being conducted in designated areas. Community representatives discussed implementation details with Harrington executives. The transformation was already underway from announcement to action. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now," Robert smiled. "Now we build something that lasts beyond both of us. Something that honors your mother's principles and perhaps redeems my legacy." "And Matthews, Claire, the legal challenges, we face them as they come," Robert replied, "with the truth as our foundation and justice as our aim." He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Together." As they returned to the reception, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from rejection to recognition, from exclusion to influence. The path ahead remained challenging, with opponents still maneuvering against them and Robert's health declining more rapidly than anyone had predicted. But for the first time in his career, Marcus wasn't fighting alone for recognition that should have been freely given based on merit. He had found not only his father but a purpose that transcended personal achievement, transforming systems that had too long perpetuated inequality under the guise of business as usual. The true measure of success wouldn't be the partnership he'd earned at Daniels and Moore, or even his position within Harrington Enterprises. It would be the communities revitalized, the opportunities created, the lives improved through the initiative that bore his father's name but would ultimately become his own legacy to build. As he rejoined the gathering, accepting congratulations and addressing questions about next steps, Marcus caught sight of William Matthews exiting the reception, his expression dark. Their eyes met briefly across the room, acknowledgement passing between adversaries that while one battle had concluded, others surely lay ahead. Marcus nodded slightly, neither gloating nor intimidated. He had faced Matthew's kind throughout his career, those who judged his worth based on preconceptions rather than merit, who protected privilege rather than embracing excellence. He would continue to face them, but now with the full weight of truth and legitimacy behind him. And in that knowledge lay a victory more meaningful than any corner office could provide.